I'm Tom Parker, and welcome to Voices from the CEPS Ideas Lab. In this episode, I spoke with Sergio Carrera. Sergio is a Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Justice and Home Affairs Unit at CEPS. He is also Adjunct Professor at the Paris School of International Affairs. During our interview, we discussed European policies on borders, migration, and asylum, and what the EU can do when member states violate fundamental rights at their borders. I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, Sergio, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
This is a particularly interesting topic for me, and when I was looking around the topic before, I didn't realise how much of this was a sort of theory and then it's becoming more into practice. But how is the EU tackling the rule of law backsliding by member states in migration and asylum?
Yeah, the area of migration policy is a very controversial one. But I think it needs to be very clear that both the member states and the European Union have obligations to comply with the rule of law and fundamental rights when implementing these policies. And this is not the case. Our research is showing a number of really serious violations at Europe's external borders on how people are treated. Asylum seekers, refugees seeking protection in Europe are not allowed to have access to protection and are dehumanized as numbers, as threats. And this concept of rule of law backsliding brings us back to the treaty values, to the European Union values, which in my view are very much at stake in the way in which the European Union is operating in these areas.
So what can the EU do? Is this a sort of EU-wide problem? Obviously from a policy and law element it is, but are there EU member states that are perhaps more culprits within this that you need to concentrate some of the solution towards?
Well, I'm afraid that there are very few good students when it comes to complying with the rule of law in the area of migration policy. But when it comes to the role of the European Commission, the Commission has the duty to enforce the treaties, to make sure that member state governments comply with fundamental rights, with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, and migration policy is no exception. Mm-hmm. Even though we see now, this is an area which is highly politicized, it doesn't make it exceptional. And yet we see a lot of crisis-making, emergency-led responses, which again have very devastating effects on people's lives and dignity.
What is perhaps to go into more detail, what is the current rule of law? What does it say? Yeah. What does it mean? What needs to be complied with?
Well, the rule of law, we have a very solid understanding in Europe that comes from the Council of Europe, the Venice Commission, and brings us back to the need to ensure that people have access to justice. Every person, for the mere fact of being a human being, should be entitled to have access to courts, to justice, to be treated with equality, with dignity. And this is, again, very much failing when it comes, for instance, to the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum that has been adopted recently, where we see policies which are highly restrictive, very intrusive on people's dignity and rights, and making the right to asylum an impossible reality, increasingly difficult reality for people in a European Union that portrays itself as the bastion of universal values and human rights. In this specific area, the European Commission more specifically is letting some governments to backslide in those international obligations, human rights obligations, in very, very worrying ways. So in our research, we are actually calling the Commission to enforce those values, not just to speak about the importance of these treaty foundations, of what the EU is all about, that brings us together, but actually to enforce those rules. And when governments do not apply the law, to bring them to court and to enforce those legal obligations, not to let them go as they wish and basically not comply with the rule of law in these fields.
I mean, are the current EU's tools enough? I mean, is there enough of a deterrent to stop the EU, some of the EU member states from acting this way?
Everything is in the treaties. Everything is in the treaties. We don't need treaty change. We don't need new laws, because nowadays in Brussels it's like, let's have a new law or let's have less laws. No, everything is very clear. Everything is there. The treaty says loud and clear the Commission has actually the duty to make sure, as a guardian of the treaties, that governments comply with their obligations, including in the area of asylum policy and migration policy and borders, Schengen, one of the key, let's say, achievements of the European Union, free movement, no internal border controls. Also there, we see several governments, irrespective of political party, not complying with the Schengen rules, reintroducing unlawfully internal border controls in the name of threats, crises, not non-evidence-based justifications. And the Commission is not bringing those countries, those governments, and ministries of interior in particular, before the courts, because they are not doing their homework. They are misbehaving, and this has been taking place for several years. Now, what is the message this gives? Impunity, that they can basically comply or adopt the rules in Brussels and then behave as they wish. But also, it attacks the legitimacy of the European Union as a whole, as the project of the Union, and particularly the role of the European Commission. If the European Commission doesn't fulfill that treaty role and uphold those values, then we close the shop.
I know this sounds like a really simple question, but why? Why is this happening? Why are they allowing this? Why are they allowing this backsliding?
I mean, I think there may be...
Is it specific to, sorry to interrupt, is it specific to each of the member states that are breaking and backsliding? Is there a particular reason that might be limited to those particular states individually? Or is this just, is there a blanket sort of apathy when it comes to this?
I think there is a quite worrying tendency that when we speak about migration, actually blurring what are we talking about? Who are we speaking of? Who is these people that these governments are aiming at when they don't comply with EU law, when they engage in pushbacks, unlawful violent expulsions at the external borders, when they conduct illegal border checks inside the Schengen area on people who look different, irrespective of their citizenship, simply people who look, they have a different skin color, or they may look, dressed up differently as we do now. So there is, in my view, a structural xenophobia and discrimination at stake, which has to do very much with the history of Europe, of colonialism, decolonialization, how certain people from certain countries are still seen as less deserving of human dignity than others, why certain refugees from certain regions are welcome open arms and not from other regions in the world. What is the justification? Is it legitimate?
Yeah.
Justification? So I think that behind many of these actions lays down a structural racism and xenophobia, playing out in the hands of the far right and extreme right parties, not challenging the agenda of those parties in many countries around Europe, with a completely different vision and understanding of what are the issues at stake, based on the historical wrongdoings in Europe and crimes against humanity in Europe. So this is not being spoken about. And therefore, it's been kind of, it's fine. If they don't comply with the rules in this area, it's okay, because it's politically sensitive. Yes, what is politically sensitive, even more so, is not to uphold the rule of law. Because the moment that the European Union throws out of the window its treaty values in any policy area, particularly this one, is the end game for European integration, which is about lifting borders. Yes. European integration has been about lifting border, about allowing free movement, about European citizenship, breaking out divisions of people depending on their nationality, which country, from one day to another, becoming a member of the Union and being an equal citizen.
Yes.
So, again, this brings us back to the very spirit of what the Union is all about. And yet, this, sadly, is not being duly considered and taken care of at the moment in the name of, you name it, emergencies, crises, far rights, but it's mainly mainstream political parties. Sadly, it's not the far right, it's mainstream political parties that are in coalition with these far right parties or that actually buy into the narrative of exclusion and division.
Okay, so just before we leave, what would be your 30-second sort of call to action? What would you like to see happen?
Well, I will first call mainstream political parties in Europe to stand up for the principles of European integration and not to legitimize extreme views, radicalized views in the area of migration and asylum that are discriminatory and racist and xenophobic. This must stop. And they should really come forward and stand up for the far wall in relation to far-right ideology and extreme right ideologies in this area. That's the first thing. The second thing is for the European Commission to play its role. The European institutions have a role assigned in the treaties for a reason. We have a European Commission that has an enforcement role to guarantee that governments comply with their obligations. And it should do that. And then the Court of Justice is there for that reason too. Rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances. It's not all government. We've had that in the past, and we know where it ends up in serious suffering and crimes against humanity. So we need courts to be independent, to ensure judicial independence at the national level and a European level, to keep accountable governments and the European Commission. So I think there needs to be a lot of focus on this, making sure that this separation of powers continues and that authority and power in the European Union is kept to the values. It's Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. It's not by coincidence.
No.
That lays down that the EU stands for, protects and promotes the rule of law, democracy and fundamental rights. The moment this ends, there is mistrust. This will be the end of European cooperation in any area. Yeah.
Well, Sergio, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.